All right. Hello and welcome. I'm Christy Giacomini, VP of Engineering and partner at Prime Movers Lab. I'd like to start by welcoming the audience. I see many of our limited partners, founders, and some of our extended Prime Movers Lab family. I'd like to also extend a special welcome to our new Growth Fund limited partners. We're so grateful to all of you for being on this journey with us. For anyone who's new to Prime Movers Lab, we are a hard tech venture firm investing in prime movers, the entrepreneurs that have the ability to positively impact billions of lives. We focus on breakthrough science companies in 6 broad vertical industries: agriculture, manufacturing, engineering, infrastructure, transportation, and relative to the topic we're talking about today, human augmentation. Given this, we live on the front lines of hard tech innovation. We see over 2,200 companies so far this year. Every 2 weeks we host webinars to share what we are learning with you and to spotlight growing industries and highlight the amazing people that are speeding up the massive adoption of technology that we are starting to currently use or will use in the future. And to that point, I'll put a plug in for our next webinar in about 3 weeks, August 9th, same time, on semiconductors and the global chip shortage, looking at future trends and investment opportunities. So before we begin on today's topic, let's do some quick housekeeping. We want to be mindful of everybody's time. We are going to keep this to an hour. We have some questions ready to get the discussion started, and we would absolutely love to hear your questions. So please use the chat or the Q&A feature to submit them. We'll save some time at the end to get those answered. And certainly feel welcome to comment in chat on anything that you found really interesting or want to share your own comments. We'd love to hear your thoughts. So with that, I am thrilled to be co-hosting this webinar with my partner, Amy Kruse. This is her brainchild for the webinar. So Amy, take it away.
You bet. Thank you, Christy, and thanks to the team. And those of us who are joining us today, again, thanks to all our LPs and the larger community. Great turnout today. Super excited to talk about BCI. Most of you know me. I'm a partner here at Prime Movers Lab. My background is actually neuroscience. I've had a crazy career journeying through places like DARPA and the defense industry and small business startups after landing here at Prime Movers Lab. And so, as part of what we're doing in the human augmentation space, one of our focus areas, both of investment and sort of overall thought leadership and investigation, is the brain-computer interface topic area. And for those of you that aren't familiar with brain-computer interfaces but tuned in anyway, I have had a couple of blogs on the topic, so feel free to go back to our content there if you want a refresher. But essentially, a brain-computer interface is a closed loop system that uses signals from the brain and interacts with an interface or other type of device in order to kind of read out those signals and either affect or change the brain or interfaces like screens or mechanical entities. And we'll talk about that a little bit more today. But I'm thrilled to be here with 4 fantastic panelists. I'm going to let them introduce themselves, and then we will dive into the questions that we've got queued up. And of course, like we said, leave plenty of time for Q&A. So maybe I'll ask Matt to kick us off. Matt is the CEO of Paradromics, which will tell you one of our most recent investments in PML, and excited to have him on the panel today.
Thanks, Amy. I'm Matt. I'm the CEO of Paradromics. We are a high data rate brain-computer interface company, and we think of brain-computer interfaces as modems for the brain. Just in the way that a modem lets your computer go online and communicate with a lot of other computers, a BCI allows your brain to go online and communicate with computers. And what I think is really instructive about that analogy is just that if you think about the way that the early internet developed, the kinds of applications you could run on 1990 internet and the kinds of things that you could run on modern broadband, the applications that you can run over the internet and the applications that you can run over BCI just keep increasing as you can open up that data pipe and start to push more data both into and out of the brain. And once you have data access, rich data access to the brain, you can start to reframe a lot of classically challenging health conditions that I think we'll talk about in the webinar.
Sounds great. Dan, how about you next?
Hey, thanks, Amy. Good to be here. So I'm Dan Rizzuto, the CEO of Nia Therapeutics, and Nia is developing an implantable brain stimulation technology for restoring memory function and the treatment of patients with memory loss. I'm a neuroscientist by training and with significant industry experience in neurotechnology development. And I developed this technology along with my scientific co-founder at the University of Pennsylvania with a significant investment from DARPA, and hope to tell you guys more about the exciting clinical data that we've developed later on.
Fantastic. Andreas, how about you next?
Hi, my name is Andreas Forsland. I'm the founder and CEO of Cognixion. We're pioneering the field of what we call assisted reality. So if you think about the role of a brain-computer interface, the ability to take your mind and interface with augmented reality, we're combining a non-invasive augmented reality head-mounted display with EEG and creating a closed-loop system that allows anyone to interact with digital content within augmented reality, as well as the physical world through connecting it to systems such as smart home controls or mobility controls. So our first market is bringing Cognixion One, which is our wearable solution to market to augment individuals that have different kinds of complex disabilities, such as motor or speech, to augment the ability to communicate or physically interact with the world around them. But what's really cool about this, the bigger assisted reality world, is if you think about the future platform, some people call it the metaverse, some people call it Internet 4.0, 5.0. In the future, this kind of interface is going to be sort of ubiquitous as a standard for biometrics and how you interface with digital content and augmented reality content. So we're really sort of pioneering the foundation, which we believe will become the standards for non-invasive biometrics regarding how you interact with people, things, places, your content, and your digital awareness of your own health. So that's what we're doing at Cognixion.
Awesome. Thank you, Andreas. And then certainly last but not least, Nishita, if you want to introduce yourself.
Yes, thanks, Amy. I'm Nishita Deka. I'm the co-founder and CEO of Sonera Magnetics. And what we're doing at Sonera is we're developing a new type of non-invasive brain sensing technology to detect magnetic signals from the brain. And I'll talk a little bit more later about what's so exciting about that. My background in particular is in electrical engineering and computer sciences. So the work that we're doing at Sonera is a spin out from technology developed by our co-founding team at UC Berkeley. Both my co-founder and I got our PhDs there. And what we're really excited about with this technology is kind of tapping into this new source of information through magnetic brain activity that people haven't really looked into and been able to utilize in a widespread manner. And so that's kind of what our company is focusing on and excited about.
Fantastic. Thank you. Christy, I think you had a question, kind of an overarching one that maybe would be good to kind of start with and maybe kick off the panel, and then we'll kind of roll from there. Sound good?
Yeah, it sounds great. Thank you, Amy. There's a lot of talk about the brain-computer interface in the news and in the media. And as we were just talking about, we see it a lot show up in movies. But the field, as I understand it, in talking to Amy, it's been around for quite a while, which surprised me to learn that as I joined Prime Movers Lab. What's new these days, or why is there this bigger, larger, all of a sudden emphasis that we're seeing in the media? Maybe sort of do a round robin.
Yeah.
Dan, why don't we start with you?
Sure. I think it's worth looking at the trends that have brought us here. So I'll speak to those, and maybe some other panelists can speak to the new emerging applications. But how we got here, like Amy said, this field has been around for decades, but there's been it seems to have hit an inflection point. And why is that? So decades of basic research investment from the federal government has produced an exponential increase in the amount of neuroscience data that scientists have generated. In addition, so that's on the science side, and in addition, on the engineering side, advances in engineering have decreased the size and the cost of sensors, and so we now have devices that are, utilizing thousands of sensor channels in a single device, which was unheard of even just a few years ago. And the third driver here, the trend, is artificial intelligence. And that's allowed us to make sense of this deluge of new data from the basic research scientists, as well as these new sensors that are being applied to new indications. And all of these trends have led to an increased translation of neuroscience findings into new applications and new therapies. So that's, I think, the reason why we've seen this, inflection point that's been hit recently.
That's great.
Yeah, and I'll add to what Dan said. I think basically based on those few trends that we've been seeing and hitting this inflection point, like he mentioned, there's suddenly this new appetite for neurotech investment and putting money into commercializing these types of systems. And so I think, there's a lot of concrete events that have happened. For example, Facebook acquiring Control Labs. I think that was a really big event. That was a really big data point. And I think it was the first time that a lot of big players and a lot of big tech companies really took a look at this and said, oh, wow, this is really happening. People are really putting money into this. They're really going to put these into headsets. And so I think those trends kind of led to these concrete events. And that's led to all this new investment in neurotech. And people are really thinking about how to actually commercialize it and not just use it for basic research anymore.
I'd like maybe chime in too, just from my perspective. We got into this field of neuroscience not because we had some novel insight regarding the science, but we had a real feel for what the market was looking for. So kind of taking the market view and bringing it to the technology as opposed to the technology trying to find a market. What we realize is that we are at an inflection point where the awareness levels are going up for this kind of technology. So when you have this sort of organic awareness, then there's an interest for education and enrollment and engagement. We also have some sort of meta themes that we've been looking at Cognixion regarding just historically. So if you look at the last 50 years, you think about the user interface and how we used to interface with, say, televisions with knobs and sliders and rabbit ears. If you didn't want to get up off the sofa and turn the channel, you would tell your son or daughter to go do it. But ultimately, they had to use their hands to do that. Then in the 80s, you had keyboards and a mouse, but it was still completely analog. In the 90s, you moved to like what Dan's saying, sensors are cheaper and now they're prolific. So you have touch-based sensors and gyroscopes and accelerometers that are in things. So you're moving from an analog IO into a completely digital sensorial IO, right? Happening kind of in the 90s and the 2000s. And now we're sort of seeing that shift also moving even further, right? Into all those sensors are now moving away from being on this device and they're on the body or in the body, whether it's a watch or in your earbuds or eyeglasses or whatever, right? And so you start to see this trajectory that sensors are getting closer to the body, they're getting smaller, more invisible and prolific. And then on the demographic side, we also see this kind of what we call the silver tsunami starting to emerge. So you think about what's happening in the 50s, you had a baby boom. And then over time, you had a huge surge in growth in population. And then we've seen sort of a gradual decline in birth rates. And so you're having sort of this, and we're getting older and living longer. So you're having sort of this aging issue that's emerging on the horizon over the next 30 years, which says we're going to have many more older people living a lot longer, more independently, but also a lot of kids who don't want to take care of their family, right? You're going to start to see more investments in robotics, caregivers, AI, and prosthetics that look like consumer electronics that are going to be helping people do everyday things. And roughly 15% of the world's population today has some form of disability, whether that's vision, hearing, sensorial, behavioral, motor. And so if you think about this, accessibility is a paramount thing to invest in to get ahead of it in order to maintain just, global, the trajectory we're on and improving sort of the state of health and wellness.
Yeah, that silver tsunami is an interesting push or pull. Matt, you had made some comments when we met a couple months ago about how there's been a lot of pieces available that maybe weren't talking to each other. That might be another.
That was exactly where I wanted to pick up. If I think of Paradromics and Neuralink and Kernel and Control Labs, all of those systems the underlying science that's feeding them and a lot of the engineering components that went into them, they've been around for a while. But what happens is that integration is hard. And I think this is like for people who haven't developed complex hardware, it's, if you work in space, you're probably familiar, integration is hard. But that's the same case in brain-computer interfaces. To bring all the parts together into a kind of singular product that can be functional and that can actually go the distance is really hard work. And to build a medical device product or a brain-facing product, that's hard and expensive work. And so what I see is that you had, as Dan was referring to, all of this foundational work, all this foundational technology and science advancement that's been going on, but in disparate areas, of the academic and industrial universe. And then it took a few players with the wherewithal and the funding to bring all those components together into systems that could be holistic, functional systems. And now that we've had a few examples of things coming together and working, more capital is flowing in, which means we're going to see more integration, more products. And we've hit this point now where we have a BCI industry that it's fledgling, but I consider it an industry, and I see, the faces on this call as being, leaders in that industry.
That's great. Yeah, no, I mean, that's been, for someone who's been around the field for a long time, the idea that there is an industry now is, I mean, it's both like, it's thrilling, it's frightening, like it's all these things like all at once, because it, when it becomes that, it kind of has its own energy, right? And brings all those pieces forward. So I'm glad that we're all engaged here and, thinking about it and talking about it. One thing I wanted to hit on, and I wanted to hit on it early because I know it's something that, that folks have asked me about, in brain-computer interfaces, there's an invasive approach, there's a non-invasive approach, there's probably going to be hybrid approaches, right, that we're going to see. I was wondering if, maybe to start with, maybe Matt and Andreas, and then we can expand it from there. What can we share with the audience about when these types of applications are most appropriate? When do you think we'll see invasive, sort of techniques used? When do you think non-invasive techniques, might be most useful? If we could just sort of cover that early for our audience.
I can break the ice. I can say if Andreas or Nishita can build you a product that does what you want, don't come looking for a Neuralink or a Paradromics product. I mean, if you can get something that ships from Amazon and you can wear and it accomplishes your goals, don't go to a neurosurgeon. Right. I think though that when it comes to data rate, there's a breaking point where there's because of the physics of extracting signals, from outside the body, there's a limited amount of information you can get outside of the body, and when you want more, you have to go in. But I think that there's a ton of interesting applications, especially in the consumer space, that you can get without ever having to go in the brain.
Yeah.
Nishita, you want to go next, or you have a?
Go ahead.
Yeah, I think it is like Amy said. It's this very dynamic. It's kind of where the river meets the bay. It's like the water. It's all water. So thinking about this in that. Sort of you kind of have to couch it into like the use case or the application, and sort of what is the right time or the right solution, product market fit for that thing. So what we've done at Cognixion is we've taken a deep dive into many different kinds of clinical conditions. We've done research on over 150 different clinical conditions that would benefit from a BCI. And we've looked at it holistically and said which things would be best for invasive versus non-invasive, and which things, things like dermal conditions or photosensitivity for certain types of things, or, biocompatibility and so on, or just, if you need to not just do reading, but you need to stimulate the brain, right? And so you might have things like tremors or epilepsy or other kinds of things that really, depending on the neurologist or the clinician, you would want to put the right product with that patient at the right time. And so we might even take a sort of a profile of like an ALS user as an archetype, right? And so all of a sudden you've got someone sort of in the middle of their life, they're in the prime of life, and then all of a sudden you're diagnosed with ALS and say, hey, ooh, things are going to change. But that's a progressive condition, right? It slides at a different rate, and so certain things start to shut down, right? So your peripheral nervous starts to shut down, but you might still be able to speak for a while. You might start to lose the ability to lift your legs or lift your arms. You might have some motor issues that are emerging. So think about this as a progressive condition. And you say, well, guess what? Maybe a non-invasive solution works with like stage 1 or stage 2, but maybe an invasive solution might be ideal for late stage, where non-invasive, to Matt's point, doesn't get you to some of that high resolution that you're looking for say, motor prosthetics or other kinds of things. Parkinson's is a great example, right? Parkinson's is a great use case for invasive. Huge market, right? Huge market. Cerebral palsy, not a good market for invasive, right? Great for non-invasive. So we start to think about these, really understanding who the users are and what the right use cases are. That's where you realize that we can all actually play well together. And the earlier conversation around interoperability, I think, is a really cool one on the horizon. So today, non-invasive can actually go to market like today. There is non-invasive today. I think BlackRock's been around for a while, but I think you guys, right, Paradromics, you guys are on a path, to being available. And so, I think over the next 5 to 10 years, we're going to see like this whole industry is going to look super dynamic. It's as if you sort of inflated a balloon and it's like, here's this, it looks like a non-filled balloon right now, but once you fill it up, then it's like, it's super, super interesting and rich. Anyway, that's my thought.
Yeah, I definitely agree with both Andreas and Matt. And I think when I think about this industry developing, I think about it as an entire ecosystem eventually, where we're going to see all these different technologies and sensor modalities working together in different ways. I even think about how you could integrate many different types of technologies together for one specific application, because maybe you need one modality to do one part of the application, maybe another one to do something else. And that's the way that it works best and is optimal for the user. And, speaking to what we're doing at Sonera, trying to figure out what we can do with magnetic signals, that's a very nascent field still in many ways. People really have only used this type of technology in very specific clinical settings, because magnetoencephalography, which is kind of the comparable technique that we're looking at, or MEG for short, is very expensive. It's very inaccessible, and you need these superconducting sensors in order to be able to do it. And so we only have really explored it for these very, very specific clinical indications, and we don't even really know what we can do until we build technologies that allow us to explore all the different things we could potentially do with these types of signals. And so there's a lot of exploration still left to be done, and kind of figuring out, what applications benefit the most from these different modalities, and what's a good fit with another thing. So I think there's a lot of exploration still to be done, in figuring out how these technologies can work together and what applications they're best for.
Yeah, just to put a fine point on it, I'll say that I hope it's non-controversially that invasive technology is just always going to be more effective than non-invasive technology. But that doesn't mean it's always the most appropriate choice for a given patient. And patients need to make their own choice, and healthy individuals buying consumer devices need to make their own choices. And I expect someday soon that healthy individuals will be making the choice between invasive implants and non-invasive devices. So for instance, in the medical domain, we talked about Parkinson's. Deep brain stimulation for Parkinson's disease and essential tremor has been around now for 20 years, FDA approved. And over time, the therapeutic efficacy of this therapy has gone up. And now about 95% of patients with good targeting and with good patient selection, about 95% of patients get effective control over their Parkinson's and their tremors. And it's even recently been shown to slow disease progression. So you advance much less, because Parkinson's is a progressive disease, and it advances much more slowly with DBS. But just recently, in the past year or two, Cala Health came around with a wearable bracelet for the treatment of essential tremor, and it was shown to be effective to reduce tremor in about 54% of patients. So the efficacy isn't quite as high as Parkinson's. It's also not been around as long. So There's obviously going to be limitations in its efficacy because it is non-invasive, but it may be suitable. You may start to see segmenting of the market where you have more mild patients starting with the non-invasive telehealth approach, and more moderately and severely affected patients going to the deep brain stimulator with the higher likelihood of success. But you also have, patients' aesthetic choices at play as well. So, for instance, the Think device, which promised, calm or energetic mental states, and they had this wearable device on the forehead. But what they learned was that nobody wants to wear a device on the forehead. This also plays into the segmentation of the market.
It always reminds me of seeing headsets where all the sensors are on the forehead, and then you're sort of like, why are the sensors on the forehead? And they're like, oh, that's where we could put them, and it's sort of it's like that might not be the best place to put the sensors, but so I think there are, there's a lot of there's both the cosmetic and sort of appearance things, as well as sometimes just easiness. Dan, if we can stay on theme with you for a second, a lot of times brain computer interfaces have been thought of in the context of motor control. We've already talked about speech. We've talked about moving prosthetic arms or other interfaces, but your team has actually focused on memory, which I actually think many people may not have heard about. And so I was wondering if you could briefly just share with us kind of what was that breakthrough around being able to augment memory through a BCI.
Yeah. So my team, first at Brandeis University, then at the University of Pennsylvania, has been, in my scientific co-founders lab at Penn, has been studying the human memory system with intracranial sensors in human patients for over 2 decades now, going back to my graduate dissertation at Brandeis University. Based on this, long-standing and those deep insights into how the neurological underpinnings of human memory, DARPA funded us in 2014 with a large investment to build a neurostimulation technology for the treatment of memory disorders, and specifically for the treatment of memory loss after brain injury. But memory disorders writ large affect 1 in 12 people. It's pretty massive, and it can have so it's a massive market, a massive global unmet need. This is due to a variety of causes, from brain injury to neurodegenerative diseases such as Alzheimer's and mild cognitive impairment, and even healthy aging. Speaking of the consumer market, healthy aging is associated with reductions in memory performance over time. And there's no effective treatments that are currently available, including for Alzheimer's patients, right? Even those drugs that are available for Alzheimer's, the big secret, the open secret, is they don't actually improve memory. They just prevent further decline for a very short period of time. So DARPA funded our team to develop this technology, and the basic approach is straightforward. We identify the personalized biomarkers of memory in each patient that underlie their memory performance. And again, this goes back, our technology, 20 years. We've been studying this. And these are electrophysiological biomarkers, the oscillatory activity. It's like EEG, but inside the brain. And then we develop a personalized therapy. We personalize the stimulation parameters to modulate those biomarkers. And you can think of it as tuning an orchestra. With memory loss, the orchestra, the brain synchronization has gotten out of tune, and we're using brain stimulation to retune it and allow the memory system to operate in a synchronized manner once again. And when you do this, we've demonstrated, again, in human patients, that we can improve memory by about 20%. We can improve list learning, like your grocery list when you're going to the store. If you just look at it once and then you go to the store without looking at it again, you might remember half of the list. We're going to help you to remember these patients to remember 20% more items than they would, and normally with our approach. And you could say, well, you know, is that significant? And the answer is yes. It's close to a half of a standard deviation, or an effect size of 0.5, which is widely shown to be significant across many types of indications. And we know that verbal memory and list learning directly impacts employment. In multiple sclerosis, if you have an outbreak of MS, a reduction in just 2 words in a list learning task can mean the difference between being employed and becoming unemployed. In traumatic brain injury, we know that verbal memory is the only thing that predicts whether you will regain employment after your injury. So these are critically important functions, and we've been able to show that we can actually, by again, sensors and stimulation, closing the loop, sensing the state of the brain, interpreting it using an artificial intelligence platform, and then developing a personalized approach to stimulate the brain to keep the patient in the zone of good memory function. And we've been able to show that these, you know, as you're pointing out, these are brain-computer interfaces that can read and write brain states. And they can now, we can successfully improve patients' memories using these new interfaces.
Yeah, I just think that's incredible. And as someone who, you know, both worked in the defense environment with TBI and other, you know, kind of brain injuries like that, you know, can like 100%, you know, sort of substantiate the return to employment function and other things associated with the memory. Like it's one of those things, like you don't know what you got till it's gone.
Till it's gone.
You
That's
know,
right.
it is definitely, and you know, it's interesting because we have talked about this before, Dan, that there are so few therapies for TBI, you know, in this space. And so, you know, the restoration of this function is incredible, and just really excited to have everybody hear about, you know, kind of what you and your team are up to. I kind of wanted to talk, you know, Andreas, you know, you've showed me a couple of movies recently about some of the brainiacs that are using your technology. And I wonder if kind of, you know, maybe a little bit briefly, but maybe you could say a little bit about how your experience in user interface and, you know, user experience design has influenced how you're thinking about BCIs, because I think this is an expanding area of where BCI is headed.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, and I think the movement now over the last, say, 5 years has been moving, you know, say BCI from sort of just a read only into a read write, right? Like closed loop systems. And how do you accommodate a read write system or a write read system non-invasively, right? You know, usually users to learn how to control, if you want to use BCI as a control interface, you've got to have some rapid cycles of biofeedback, right? So how do you encourage that learning, right? And the plasticity to understand how to adopt a new kind of interface. And so what we've looked at is kind of like what Nishita was saying, is how do we deal with multiple types of sensors, not just BCI, and how do we have different sensors collaborating with each other to sort of shore up the gaps of the user's learning curve and also the speed at which they can interact with something. So as an example, we've combined sensors that are, say motion sensors with EEG, and we've been able to rapidly enhance the user's ability to make selections in a UI. And then if you couple machine learning and natural language processing, you know, in our language system. So Tom Gruber is the co-founder and CTO of Siri. And he was with Apple for 8 years after they acquired his company, which we all know where Siri has gone. So he's working with our engineering team on helping us create sort of a next generation corpus and a language system that can be used in an AR environment controlled by BCI. So we're essentially developing the front-end communication interface for language access to reduce the cognitive and caloric load, how much energy is expended in order to produce longer mean utterance lengths of expressions. So essentially, how many fewer clicks does it take to type out your thoughts, if you will? And then so as a 1.0, for Cognixion 1, this is really how we're able to get these words per minute rates really, really high. So today, sort of the industry standard, or even just, in the lab, the fastest BCI spellers are roughly like 6 words per minute. Yeah. And that's blazingly fast. If you use eye tracking, you can get up to maybe 12 to 15 words per minute, but it's still, thumb typing on a smartphone, you're at roughly 30 to 40 words per minute, verbal is around 100 to 150 words per minute. So our objective with Cognixion 1 and what we're doing is combining multiple sensors with AI and language systems to complete a solution that allows a user to communicate at 30 to 60 words per minute fluidly. Because once someone can communicate, if they're nonverbal, they can communicate at 30 to 60 words per minute. They can actually have spontaneous conversations. They can do error correction on the fly. They can have turn taking. So within a 60-second dialogue, instead of waiting 60 seconds for someone to speak out their first phrase, you might have 5 or 6 turns of back and forth conversation within a 1-minute session. So that's where you see life change happen right in front of you. When someone who you maybe saw decline and they couldn't speak after a while, or maybe they had a stroke and then bam, it's just language is gone. The ability to take something that's impossible, make it possible with a very low learning curve is super powerful. So what we're doing is we sort of take this analogy of, we work with some of our brainiacs. That's what we call our user advisory council. So we have about 120 today that are end users, neurologists, speech language pathologists, individuals with ALS, CP, stroke, and they're working with us on a regular basis to help co-design this work and test it out. So I think what's super important for everyone on this call or everyone that's in the audience is to understand, hey, BCI itself isn't a silver bullet, right? Having a strategy to figure out how you can ensure the user success with your system is going to be paramount. And so spending time with end users, understanding how they're going to learn how to ride the bike or juggle the balls or control the cursor with their mind, you got to figure out what it's going to take to help them experience that as quickly as possible. So my last point on this is I'll share an acronym, 2 acronyms that we use here at Cognixion. One is MVA, minimum viable awesome. So, ultimately it's not the minimum viable product, it's the minimum viable thing that's going to get your user to do backflips and be excited. And then the other is, in order to get to MVA, you have to do TTV, which is time to value. So how can you compress the amount of time for that user to experience that aha moment that they're like, yes, I did it. And it didn't take me a year to do it. It took me 30 seconds to do it. So whatever your respective technology is, how can you shrink the TTV such that the users have that epiphany? Because the sooner they have that, the sooner they have the self-confidence to then keep going with it, right?
Yeah, I love the example that you gave, and what we're all after here is the life improvement, and the context in which you gave for the example of words per minute was really illuminating for me. Thank you.
Oh, you bet, Christy.
So, Christy, I actually thought you had some questions around the magnetics when we had talked about that. Do you want to?
Oh, yeah. Nishita, this is obviously for you. As I've been learning, one of the holy grails in brain-computer interfaces is high resolution and high spatiotemporal systems that, like we've been talking about, is non-invasive. You are building a deployable magnetic imaging system that I really clued into, because Amy described as trying to get from one of those old hair dryer, big monstrosity things. Anyway, so I'll stop there, and I'd love for you to tell us what's so special about magnets.
Yeah, so without getting too technical, I think a really simple way to understand it is, when you think about neurons firing in the brain, they're giving off electrical impulses and associated magnetic fields. So for the most part, a lot of the the gold standard in neurology with non-invasive has been EEG, just like putting an EEG system on someone and being able to read those electrical signals. The comparable technology to that on the magnetic side is something called magnetoencephalography, or MEG. The reason why we haven't really utilized this very much is because they need, as I said earlier, superconducting sensors to operate. And so the result of that is you have this big room-sized machine. It needs to be shielded to protect the sensors. It needs super cooling, so you have it attached to these liquid helium tanks, and it's really infeasible for really most applications. It's only right now used for a couple clinical indications, primarily for pre-surgical scanning for epilepsy and then mapping the functional cortex prior to surgery for patients with brain tumors. The thing that's really exciting about being able to measure magnetic signals is if you think about how these signals are generated from the neuron and passing through the different layers of like tissue, fluid, and skull. With electrical signals, they're heavily attenuated by all of these layers, but especially heavily attenuated by the skull. It's very low conductivity. And so the result of that is that you have all this attenuation by the time the signal reaches the scalp. And that's kind of been the big challenge with working with the EEG signals. With magnetic signals, it's a little bit different. The magnetic permeability of all these layers is effectively the same. And so the result of that is that you're basically taking less of a hit at the skull than you would with electrical signals. And so your signal, once it reaches the scalp, is of higher fidelity. And so with MEG, for example, you can typically get about 10 times higher spatial resolution, similar temporal, but 10 times higher spatial resolution than you can with the EEG. And so there's a lot of interesting different information you can gather by reading magnetic brain activity instead of just reading electrical brain activity. And there's pros and cons of both. And so for us, kind of the questions we're looking into are, what can we do with this, increased fidelity? I don't think we even really know what we can do with it. And I think in this field, and I'd love to hear what the other panelists think, but I think in this field, it's really hard to make a priori assumptions about what you can and can't do. And so we're kind of trying to build this technology and trying to understand, what are the questions we need to ask? What are the experiments we need to run in order to figure out, what you can do with this higher fidelity level of information? Is it something that can be used in conjunction with the EEG, where you can build an even better system by using these technologies together? So that's kind of the exciting thing for us and what's really exciting and special about magnetic signals. And there's, of course, other factors that make it in many ways more feasible for adoption. For example, you don't need contact with magnetic sensors in the same way that you do with electrical. So things like skin, sweat, clothing, hair, all of that becomes less of a problem with reading magnetic signals than it is with electrical signals.
So do I understand you in that this is more of a diagnostic rather than tool for affecting data going back into the brain?
So this is more, the best way to understand it is just, this is more of a system for reading and visualizing brain activity, but a different set of information that's coming from the brain. That's really what our technology is trying to do. And then from there, you can do, other things with that information, whether it's, apply that to neuromodulation technologies or neurostimulation technologies. But basically, we're trying to figure out, is there a way to have more higher fidelity information read from the brain and visualize things in a more localized, clear manner?
That's awesome. Awesome. Well, I wanted to open it up. We've got a couple of questions in the Q&A, and I kind of wanted to maybe weave them together. One of the questions that folks are asking is both about the regulatory environment, so has it right now as it stands, has it promoted innovation? Has it held back innovation? Are there things that you would sort of like to see changed? And then maybe we can kind of weave that into, some questions about maybe implementation. So let's take the regulatory kind of question first, if anybody has any, sort of comments or experience there.
Yeah,
I can. Oh,
go ahead, Andreas.
Well, I was just going to say, like for us, like we're designing our core system to scale to consumer, like direct to consumer, but we're starting with regulatory. And so for us, it's about threading a needle as a class 2 device. So how do we thread that needle all the way through to insurance funding? So looking sort of through the FDA to say, what do we need to do through the FDA to get to CMS, to Medicare, to so on and so on. And so for us working backwards, we've seen by sort of looking at the end state and working backwards as like we're aiming towards speech generating devices and environmental control. So there's a clear line for us to sort of go through the FDA process with predicates on other kinds of technologies, but there's at least existing coding and there's some precedent there on certain aspects of what we're doing. So I'd say our pathway through regulatory is because of how we've looked at it from a strategy perspective. Our first way through the regulatory pathway is it's not going to be without bumps, but it's going to be shorter than I think what the invasive group here is dealing with. But I'm also encouraged by the FDA opening up like the breakthrough device program and BCI actually being a topic at the FDA that's getting a lot of attention right now. So just maybe Dan, Matt, Nishita, you can talk about your perspective.
Yeah, I like you, I've been very impressed with the FDA's posture recently. That hasn't always been the case. Even 10 years ago, they were very much seen as a roadblock in the neurotechnology space, but that's no longer the case. And in my experience with Nia, we've had several meetings with the FDA already, and they've shown themselves to be true collaborative partners in the development process. And like Andreas pointed out, with the Breakthrough Devices program, they're starting to understand the importance of speed, working closely with entrepreneurs and companies to develop these technologies. So I no longer see the FDA as a roadblock really, but more as a partner for development to ensure that you've got a safe and effective device. The real challenge in implantable devices, as far as I'm concerned, is around reimbursement. And that pathway is much more vague and harder to navigate, in my opinion. And that's where the real challenges lie in the BCI space nowadays. It's not the FDA.
Right. Very interesting. One question came up: Are any of the panelists actually seeking right now breakthrough device designation, or will be?
We
plan to. Yes.
Yeah, we have a two-pronged strategy right now. So based on our current strategy, plan A is there's a chance that our system could be exempt, ironically. So based on how we're approaching it. If we're approved as an exempt class 2 device, we're off to the races. If they don't accept it as a class 2 exempt device, we would fall back to a de novo, which we would then file for breakthrough device as a class 2 and then go through the requisite process for verification and validation.
Right, and Dan, you're doing that as well?
Yeah, different strategy than Andreas, but yes, we're planning to apply for breakthrough as soon as we have some bandwidth.
Picking up on that thread, Dan mentioned the difficulty for new medical devices to get reimbursement. And one of the things that I think, we should recognize is the FDA and CMS kind of working together through the Breakthrough Devices program to make sure that for those devices that do get designation as breakthrough devices, and 2 that have had it so far in our field, obviously Synchron's device as well as Neuralink's device, both are breakthrough devices now with the FDA. When they come out and get an approval at the other end, they'll be reimbursed by CMS for the first 2 years. And so that's an important handoff that they orchestrated, because probably more so than the regulatory process per se, being a breakthrough device and getting immediate reimbursement really helps companies like ours to get a foothold in the market. The other thing I want to say, and picking up again on this idea that the new FDA, the FDA is not just a regulatory agency. It has great research scientists, and it does real research in this field. And so one of the things that the FDA has actually been developing are better accelerated aging tests for devices. So the FDA actually recognized that it's an issue that accelerated aging testing is not very predictive of in vivo performance. So they put money, and their own researchers worked on developing reactive accelerated aging tests that are automated, and they're actually trying to push the field forward by creating opportunities for people to move more quickly through the regulatory process and show that devices are safer sooner. So yeah, I mean, obviously having a regulated field, government agencies will never be as agile as startups. That's just a reality. But I think that the groups and the people there, they're really making an effort to streamline.
Yeah, I wanted to weave a couple of questions together that have sort of come in. Obviously, there was some, somebody made a comment like a lot of these seem like medical devices. When will these be used in sort of neurotypical individuals? And also, I just wanted to draw in the thread of like, kind of some of the conversations around, ethical and social issues that have come up around the use of these devices. And so maybe open question to the panel around maybe the transition of these, from medical to I don't want to call them consumer, maybe we'll call them commercial. And also maybe some of the things that you've been thinking around the ethics and social implications of those.
I would sort of look at this as like there's a blurry line, and we've been talking about this before, but of restoration versus performance, or restoration and transitioning to recreation, so is there a recreational use case for BCI? Is there a performance enhancement aspect of BCI? And Dan kind of talked about it a bit regarding memory restoration, maybe for Alzheimer's, but boy, kids today, if there was a way to take some of that IP and put it into the education system to affect people's abilities to solve problems, work better, to deal with joint decision-making, group decision-making, learning enhancement, there's interesting use cases if there was a way to sort of package it in a way that was accessible, right? So.
Andreas, I laughed because you started to say kids today, and I thought you were going to go to video games.
Well, that's the obvious, right? But, can you get your mind in the game, so to speak? Is that like the EA next tagline or something in the game? And I don't know how many people on the panel have read or listened to the audiobook Ready Player 2, but it was funny. When we first announced what we were doing, we got a bunch of funny comments like, "Oh my God, this is Oni from Ready Player 2," and we're like, "Oh, hold on, what is this Oni thing?" So,
funny. Oh, funny.
So, well, yeah, and I mean, they paint a picture of the future where literally you're fully simulating you're stimulating all of your senses and fooling the mind into believing it truly is somewhere else. And like, that's an interesting future for the books, but I think there will be a metaverse. I think there will be this interesting overlay on the world through glasses or through other interfaces that will bring up information that's contextually relevant. So imagine, you're cruising around and, you've got a smart city with smart autonomous vehicles, and you've got prolific Wi-Fi, 7, you're going to have gobs of information at your disposal. So ultimately, what is going to be important is filtering, right? So in that future world, what's important is filtering. And how do you filter something autonomically, right? You need to know what's going on in the mind and the body and be able to create preferences. So we look at the future as saying the future needs an accessibility layer, and that accessibility layer is synonymous with personalization. And underneath personalization comes sensors, biometrics, BCI, things like this, for determining intent. And so I could say, hey, like I want to have a high pass filter to say there's information overload, and I want to cut that way back. I only want to see certain information when certain people come in my presence, right? I don't need to walk down Times Square and see the names hovering over everyone's faces. I just need to see the ones pop up that I might be 1 degree separated from, right? So thinking about this in a bigger sense of how do you personalize that experience, and how does neurotechnology play a role in that? That's what I'm super geeking out about, besides kind of like like we're executing on a plan today, but thinking about the possibilities of how neurotechnology could open up all kinds of interesting use cases that have nothing to do with restoration or rehabilitation.
Yeah. Others?
Yeah, I'll add a little bit to what Andreas said. I think, for both of us especially, and it sounds like this is what Andreas is doing, coming from a non-invasive tech, it's exciting because you kind of have the opportunity to explore this enhancement and restoration simultaneously. It doesn't really have to be an either or. And I think that's what's been most exciting for us, like really looking seriously at potential consumer applications and things that we can do that are enhancing capabilities for healthy, neurotypical individuals, not just, the restoration side. And so that's something that we're seriously considering. I think there's a lot of really interesting work in like the health and wellness space. There's a lot of really interesting applications. I mean, there's things that I don't necessarily consider neurotech, but that are in the health and wellness space. For example, the Oura Ring or the Apple Watch, even all these things, they've made a really big impact on people's lives. And so I'm excited about, what we could potentially do with a non-invasive neurotech in these, health and wellness industries that are not just for restoration, but for just tracking your health and things like that. And then there's, of course, things like gaming. That's become a really big thing. Can we implement these types of things in gaming systems? And that's also something coming from a non-invasive stance that we can kind of explore early on and figure out whether there's some real value there in like the entertainment and gaming industry. So from our position at Sonera, we're really heavily focused on building this new type of hardware. And that's kind of the big challenge for us. And then simultaneously exploring, where do we fit in best? Is that restoration or is that enhancement? And I think that's a question that we're still trying to figure out and answer as we grow.
Yeah, that makes sense. Well, we're kind of in our last 4 minutes here. So I'd like to kind of wrap it up with a question for the whole panel. So maybe you can each do a quick, 20-second, 30-second piece on, other than your own technology that you're working on, which is of course the most interesting. I'm actually really curious your quick thoughts on what are you most excited about in either the BCI space or the neurotechnology space in the next few years. So, okay, speed round, go.
Or I'll jump in. So I'm excited about this notion of being a part of the stack, like a fundamental part of the stack for Internet 5.0. Like, what is the next generation platform for connecting to the world and connecting to people? I'm super interested in that. And I think finding a way to get 8 billion people connected and interacting together, having accessibility and inclusion is going to be amazing. For us, there's about 500 million people worldwide that are affected by disorders or conditions that affect motor and speech. So, if we were able to affect the lives of 500 million people within the next 10 years and unlock communication and independence, what would the ripple effects be in society, right? Like, imagine what the world would look like on household income, on mental health, on like all these aspects, just by addressing a root cause issue of communication control. So that's super interesting to me.
I love it. Who's next?
I'll step in. And I'm a big fan of Helen Mayberg's work in using deep brain stimulation for major depression. She's been doing incredible work, first at Emory, then at Mount Sinai in New York City. And recently her team has shown about an 80% success rate. That is 80% of patients going into significant reductions or remission of major depression, treatment-resistant depression, using brain stimulation of the subgenual cingulate cortex. And depression is a widespread problem. Over 5 million Americans currently living with some form of depression. Treatment resistant is over 1 million, and huge societal burden. And she's doing great work.
Matt, what do you got?
I'm excited about how the new generation of technologies feed into clinical research. So I think Dan's example of DBS for depression is great. And that's with a system that was designed in like the late 70s, early 80s. And that's been what all clinicians have had to use. They've been using deep brain stimulators, they've been using Utah arrays, but now we have, a new generation of really high data rate stuff coming out in academia and in industry. And it's going to be in the hands of clinicians and clinical researchers soon to discover new applications. And I think you could say the same thing with the kind of work that Nishita is doing now on the non-invasive side. You're going to have the Soneras, the kernels making these kinds of technologies available. and we're going to get to see, like, if we could do all of this with 20-year-old technology, if we've gone this far with this kind of dinosaur stuff, like how far could we go now that we have the Neuralinks, the kernels, the Soneras, coming out? That's pretty exciting to me.
Yeah.
And the Paradromics.
I wasn't allowed to mention myself.
Yeah. Nishita, you get the last word. What are you most excited about?
I'll add a little bit to what Matt said. So zooming out really high level, I think what I'm most excited about, and this kind of is in line with what Matt just said, is seeing, like, in the next 5 years, what new devices, like real devices and real use cases, are going to come out of all these different technologies. Kind of like what we mentioned earlier, we were talking about what's changed recently. There's just so much funding going to the space, so much real money being put into the space. And I think it's going to have a really big impact in 4 to 5 years. Like, we're going to actually see a lot of real things come out of the neurotech industry that are used on a commercial scale and not just in basic research. And I'm really excited to see, like, where all this is going to lead eventually.
Awesome.
That's a great note to end on.
I know. As always, more questions than time we have. We'll be doing a webinar recap. I in a blog. I have a really cool graphic to share with you guys. We want to thank our panelists today for an awesome interchange. We could have spent another 3 hours doing this, so maybe I'll do a longer one some other time. But thank you to everybody. Thank you to our Prime Movers family and the larger ecosystem. It was a pleasure. So thanks,
Thanks,
guys.
Amy. Thanks,
Yeah.
Christy.
Thanks, Amy.
Yep. Cheers.